So Bahai.chat is a conversation series dedicated to our interconnectedness. So our goal at Bahai.chat is to create an uplifting moment where we can turn our thoughts to spiritual ideas. Each weekly session is rooted in the Baha'i writings and the fundamental teachings of the oneness of mankind, the oneness of God, the oneness of religion. And we have asked individuals who really put these qualities into action to share with us their reflections of how they apply these teachings. Core to the Baha'i faith is the idea of independent investigation of truth, which means that nobody's faith should be conditioned on anything other than their own search for and understanding of truth. So as Baha'is, we're encouraged to read, to study, to look into what is true and what is true for me, and how do I understand that? So hopefully through these various speakers that we have, we can all come closer to understanding truth at the deepest level, the level of spiritual reality. Baha'u'llah, who is the founder, the prophet founder of the Baha'i faith, teaches us that the oneness of mankind is not just important, but it's a spiritual imperative. And that in order to achieve this unity, especially at this deepest level of unity through our spiritual reality, we must first establish justice. And Baha'u'llah even says that the purpose of justice is the appearance of unity amongst men. So Baha'is are encouraged, whether in our school or in our work, in our individual communities with our neighbors, to create coherence between these ideas of unity and love and justice for the sake of the oneness of mankind. I am so excited to introduce our speaker for today, who is somebody who takes these ideas of justice for the sake of unity into the most critical spaces. Our presenter today is Ruha Benjamin, who is an associate professor of African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the founder of Just Data Lab and the author of many, many books and papers, including her most recent book, Race After Technology, Abolitionist Tools for the New Jim Code. Her work investigates the social dimensions of science, medicine, and technology with a focus on the relationship between innovation and inequity, health and justice, knowledge and power. Professor Benjamin is the recipient of numerous awards and fellowships. She has received awards from the National Science Foundation, Institute of Advanced Study, and the President's Award for Distinguished Teaching at Princeton. You can read more about her at ruhabenjamin.com, but we are so excited to have her. We're so excited to have all of you logged on. And so with that, I will turn it over to Ruha.
Hey everyone, thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank the Bahai.chat organizers for getting us into this virtual space together. And for all of you for tuning in, I want to say a special shout out to my mom. See, Mom, I'm wearing that cute shirt you got me. So I just want to make sure, since we're all kind of separated, hi. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to share my screen with you guys, and we're going to talk for, I'll share some reflections for about 20 minutes. 25 minutes, and I'm a visual learner, so I use a lot of images that go along with the discussion, and then I'll come back onto your screen so you can see me, and we'll have a conversation. You can send your questions and reflections to those various channels that were mentioned earlier. So let's go to some images. The pandemic as a portal. So if I'm blocking the screen, you can toggle with the video and move my face out of your way. So we're all experiencing this pandemic with different levels of uncertainty, stress, and vulnerability. Some of us have already lost friends and family. Many have lost or are at risk of losing jobs, homes, and so many other things that sustain us. One thing we've all lost is a sense of normality. And perhaps that's the point of all of this. After all, the good old days of a month ago were not good even then for so many people. On a personal note, this period has brought back memories of losing my father suddenly in 2014 after he was infected with the H1N1 virus. Now, like then, I feel the need to mourn and to practice hopefulness. I say practice hopefulness because hope aren't simply things we feel, but they're things we do. And so over the course of the next hour, there's going to be aspects of the conversation that are going to be heavy, that are going to be angry, that are going to seem like the opposite of joy. But for me, knowledge actually sparks joy, even when that knowledge is disconcerting or troubling. So I'd like to begin my reflections with a recent essay called "The Pandemic is a Portal" by one of my favorite writers and thinkers, Arundhati Roy. She writes, historically, pandemics have forced humans to break with the past and imagine their world anew. This one is no different. It's a portal, a gateway between one world and the next. We can choose to walk through it, dragging the carcasses of our prejudice and hatred, our avarice, our data banks and dead ideas, our dead rivers and smoky skies behind us. Or we can walk through lightly with little luggage, ready to imagine another world and ready to fight for it. And what I want to suggest is that we're walking through this portal as individuals, as communities and institutions, and as a planet. At all levels, there is a choice to drag the carcasses of prejudice, hatred, and dead ideas with us, or to walk through lightly. To do this, though, we have to honestly reckon with what we've all been carrying as individuals, communities, institutions, because if we're not careful, we may carry prejudice, hatred, and dead ideas with us that we're not even fully aware of. And while a lot may be out of our control, immediate control, we can all use this time to reflect deeply on how our own commitments are shaped in light of this vision articulated in the Baha'i writings. From every standpoint, the world of humanity is undergoing a reformation. Our standards of ethics, moral codes, and methods of living in the past will not suffice for the present age of advancement and progress. Undergoing a reformation is a key phrase, I think, because the world doesn't inevitably or naturally change for the better. It has always taken work. It has always required commitment. And often, as we're learning through this pandemic, it means undergoing an unimaginable crisis. Consider that the global spread of a microscopic virus is placing the ravages of racism and inequity under the microscope. But the fact is, we don't all see the same thing. Racism actually has a way of distorting our vision. Intertwined with many other forms of social domination, racism is mercurial, it's innovative, even viral. For the purposes of this discussion today, I'm going to focus specifically on how anti-blackness distorts reality, interpersonally and institutionally, exposing Black people to a threatening environment well before this pandemic, even in childhood. Exhibit A. A recent study at Yale found that when preschool teachers were asked to look at video clips of children playing, then prompted them to look for challenging behavior, eye-tracking technology detected that the teachers routinely trained their attention on Black children, singling out Black boys in particular, which helps explain why Black students are expelled and suspended from school far more than their white peers. For some teachers, this may be unconscious and implicit, as these headlines say, but for many educators, their anti-Blackness is very explicit, conscious, and condoned. And this isn't limited to white teachers, though since the vast majority of teachers are white women, their hostility towards Black children has a far-reaching impact. Teachers' inability to truly see the inherent and unqualified worth of all children ripples across our educational system, through our carceral system, down our social and foster care system, and even up through our healthcare system, which brings us to this pandemic. Yes, the virus is a threat that should, in theory, unify people of all backgrounds, but it won't, so long as anti-Blackness continues to distort our vision. Because as a Black person, you may be wearing a mask for safety and solidarity, but your Blackness may still be a threat. Remember those preschool teachers. As Aaron Thomas reflected on Twitter, I don't feel safe wearing a handkerchief or something else that isn't clearly a protective mask covering my face to the store because I'm a Black man living in this world. I want to stay alive, but I also want to stay alive. This is the fundamental tension, I think, staying alive, but also staying alive. Black people are not only trying to survive the pandemic, but also the everyday racism of a sick society. In fact, we may endanger ourselves by acting in solidarity with everyone else wearing a homemade mask to the store. The fact is, surviving systems of white supremacy has often entailed wearing masks, in the sense that Frantz Fanon wrote in the classic text, "Black skin, white masks," symbolic coverings that attempt to shield the wearer from an oppressive gaze. Though in doing so, mask wearers run the risk of internalizing the distorted image that is projected onto us, a kind of symbolic violence. There's one passage where Fanon writes, superiority, inferiority, why not simply try to touch the other, feel the other, discover each other? Hopeful, I know, but what if, in this time of social distancing, more people wake up to the reality of how socially distant we have always been? Racism as a technology of proximity and power. But how long must we wear these masks? Turning to writer James Baldwin, love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Love in this case is not a sanitizing platitude, but a fiery force that may very well clear a trail through this portal. I think the only way we can forge a more livable world amidst the ruins of the old is if we reckon honestly with how business as usual has wreaked havoc on people's lives well before the current crisis. Many people on this planet have already been living in various states of crisis, ignored, explained away, papered over, endlessly documented and studied. As the poet M. Norbisi Philip has written, were we in this together, we would not be in this together. Were we in this together, we would not be in this together. So much truth in so few words. We've all heard or seen the public health catchphrase, viruses don't discriminate, and neither should we. As an aspirational slogan, I appreciate how this tries to push back on the different forms of racism and xenophobia we've been witnessing, from the dog whistle phrase Chinese virus to the verbal harassment, denial of services, and physical attacks on our Asian American friends. But as a soundbite, the idea that viruses don't discriminate conceals the fact that the virus is not simply a biological entity, but a biopolitical reality which travels along well-worn paths of inequity. Consider these headlines. Black people make up 40% of COVID-19 deaths in Michigan. Early data shows African Americans have contracted and died of coronavirus at an alarming rate. Wealthy LA areas have higher rates of coronavirus. Why those numbers are deceiving. The pathology of American racism is making the pathology of the coronavirus worse. And if we zoom the lens out further, globally, we'd find headlines like, for many across the world, social distancing is a luxury. Taken together, one message is clear. The coronavirus is not the great equalizer. With this in mind, many people are calling for more data on the disproportionate rates of infection and death among poor and racialized groups. And while I tend to support more data collection, I want to offer a caution. The facts alone will not save us. According to a recent study on criminal justice reform out of Stanford, researchers demonstrated that using statistics to inform the public about racial disparities can backfire. Worse yet, it can cause some people to be more supportive of the policies that can create those inequalities. In other words, two people can see the same headline. Black people make up 40% of COVID-19 deaths in Michigan, and come to very different conclusions. And I'd be happy to discuss specific examples of how this is happening right now. But for now, my point is that two people can look at the same data and interpret them in dramatically different ways. One person narrowing the focus on individual bodies and behaviors, and another zooming the lens out to include all of the factors that actually lead to illness and premature death. And I should say that the narrow interpretation is not simply lazy or just another opinion. It's wrong and dangerous. To speak only of pre-existing biological conditions in the way that some people are when they're talking about Black death from the virus is to normalize and naturalize Black death. So we have to be really clear about the pre-existing social conditions in housing, employment, education, and healthcare that have impacted communities well before the pandemic. As epidemiologist Nancy Krieger shows through her eco-social model, this is a model that demonstrates the way that our social order gets under our skin and shapes life chances. It helps explain why poor and racialized people were less likely to get tested early on in the first place, more likely to be turned away from the hospital with symptoms, less likely to have insurance coverage, more likely to be working in low-paying but essential jobs, less likely to have the option of sheltering in place, more likely to live near heavily polluted areas that make them more vulnerable to respiratory disease, less likely to have paid sick leave, and more likely to die, not inevitably, but predictably. This model illustrates how the pre-existing social conditions of our nations, not simply the pre-existing biological conditions of individuals, leads to higher Black death rates, higher Indigenous death rates, higher Latinx death rates. This virus is not simply biological, but biopolitical. It may not set out to discriminate, but the structures in which it circulates certainly do. Exhibit C. In an interview last week, French doctors, one of them the head of intensive care unit in Paris, had the audacity to suggest on live TV that a coronavirus vaccine should be tested on Africans because they are, quote, highly exposed and don't protect themselves. Fortunately, in the age of social media, this particular form of anti-Blackness was swiftly refuted by people around the world, almost as it was happening. People who insisted that Africa is not a laboratory and Black people are not guinea pigs. So whether we're talking about France's 35-year medical campaign throughout Central Africa in which people were forcibly examined and injected with medications with severe, sometimes fatal side effects, or we're talking about the United States' 40-year public health experiment on Black men in Tuskegee, Alabama, the history of medical racism is much longer than many people realize, as my colleague Harriet Washington's work illustrates. This pattern of medical abuse is just one of the dead carcasses that we cannot afford to drag through this portal, in part because it counteracts the vital work of healthcare workers trying to actually address this pandemic. As Musa Akongo writes, we see a disparate group of medical professionals working together across borders, sharing knowledge and resources. We see them without fanfare, discarding the old dynamics of Western imposition in favor of an ethos of genuine global coalition. If there can be any vision for a better future, then it is one where nations operate in the spirit of collaboration, not exploitation. At the moment, the very people who we should be able to rely on to administer policies to safeguard the health of our communities are instead employing predictable forms of racial profiling. Exhibit D. The first person in Britain to be arrested and convicted under the Coronavirus Act was a Black woman, Marie Deneau, pictured here. She was arrested and fined for failing to provide identity or reasons for travel to police and failing to comply with requirements which authorities now admit were bogus charges. Or when a Black doctor who works at the University of Miami who'd been testing homeless people for COVID-19 was arrested by police outside his home for not showing ID, or more accurately for not showing mandatory deference as the officer demanded. You should refer to me as sir or sergeant when talking to me. It's worth noting that in the video of the arrest, Dr. Henderson is the one wearing a mask, but the officer is not, exposing the doctor not just to everyday racism, but possibly the virus itself. Indeed, the vast public health surveillance structures being rolled out will likely rest on forms of containment and punishment that already target racialized people. And while the examples of anti-blackness I've shared so far have been relatively straightforward and obvious, there are many other subtle varieties that can be harder to detect because they come wrapped in the packaging of fairness, innovation, and progress, which I'd be happy to discuss when we open things up. For now, let me just underscore the fact that the scarcity we are witnessing and experiencing all around us, whether we're talking about ventilator shortages or food shortages, scarcity is manufactured. The fact that we don't seem to have the resources to meet the needs of everyone who needs it is not inevitable, but the outcome of choices people and institutions make. Which means as we move through this portal, we must insist on different choices, on radically different investments. And these investments are not simply material ones, but ideological. So if the pandemic is a portal, what new ideas do we want to guide our thinking and world building? Because as Roy put in that essay I started with, nothing could be worse than a return to normality. For the purposes of this discussion, I want to focus on the kind of transformation that has to happen at the level of our social consciousness, where anti-blackness is so deeply lodged, justifying the forms of inequity upon which the rest of our structures are built. Consider an alternative vision, that Black people are like the pupil of the eye that is dark in color, but is a fount of light and the revealer of the contingent world. Now consider this description, which I'm citing from the Baha'i writings, against the backdrop of the dominant racist discourse of our societies, which would even blame Black people for their own COVID-related deaths. The distinction I'm drawing is between Black pathology and Black perception or vision. Of course, Blackness doesn't magically confer perception, as we see when Black elites denigrate poor Black people as a form of pre-pandemic social distancing. The point is, none of us are naturally immune to the dangerous lie that is white supremacy, or the fiction of Black pathology and inferiority, because it infects every single aspect of our lives, which is precisely why this designation of Black people as the pupil of the eye is potentially transformative. Baha'u'llah did not encourage people to ignore race and pretend to be colorblind. As Professor of Literature Derek Smith explains in this article, through his pupil of the eye metaphor, which adamantly centers Black life in the figurative body of humanity, Baha'u'llah acted as a social physician, prescribing a spiritual and social concept that must be regarded as something more than a gesture of comfort or solace for a historically burdened people, Smith writes. Baha'u'llah's specific and explicit refutation of one of modernity's most hateful and divisive social ideologies is an instructive prescription addressed to all humanity. Surely the condition of oneness that is global society's highest and most urgent aspiration is impossible without the universal internalization of the medicine that Baha'u'llah has loaded into the pupil of the eye metaphor. So what does this internalization look and feel like practically? For starters, it moves beyond platitudes about loving our neighbor and treating everyone the same. This kind of lip service doesn't simply fall short, but it actually is dangerous when those who benefit from systems of oppression fail to reckon honestly with what plagues us. However, this doesn't mean that we have to resign ourselves to a somber, joyless pessimism. Even during this deadly pandemic, there are myriad ways that people are engendering justice and joy. Whether we're talking about all of the mutual aid networks working overtime to raise money, deliver groceries, check in on neighbors, and the gendered care work that holds all of our societies together, essential but devalued. And those advocating for the release of prisoners who are especially vulnerable at this time, or those working and organizing in warehouses, grocery stores, farms, and the gig economy, so that companies and corporations will put people's lives over profit. And what about all the de facto music therapy, all the DJs and musicians transporting tens of thousands of people around the globe out of our living rooms onto virtual dance floors? From the spirituals, blues, jazz, and hip hop, Black communities have always harnessed the therapeutic power of art. It's no wonder that Baha'u'llah says that music is a ladder for the soul, just one of the ways that we practice joy and express grief and anger. Joy gives us wings. In times of joy, our strength is more vital, our intellect keener, our understanding less crowded. We seem better able to cope with the vicissitudes of life, with the world, and to find our sphere of usefulness. So then, if racism distorts our vision, perhaps joy is one way of clarifying it, helping us to discern what we want to keep and what we want to let go of as individuals, as societies, as we move through this portal. The struggle for justice is about laws and policies, yes, just institutions and social structures, but it also entails living justly, and not only in how we treat others, but also in how we understand ourselves, a capacity to think our own thoughts, feel our own hearts, exercise our God-given potential without the tyranny of external forces robbing us of that ability. So then my question for each of you, for each of us, is if this pandemic is a portal, in what direction do we want to go? What dead ideas are we ready to let go of? What new vision of ourselves and the world do we want to cultivate? And most importantly, how? For me, Baha'i communities around the world are kind of like laboratories for world building. They're contexts where spiritual beliefs such as the oneness of humanity are put to the test. These teachings are like elegant theories for how to build a just and loving world, but without community life, from small villages to large cities and everything in between, working to test these theories through trial and error, beliefs remain merely theoretical. The Baha'i writings explain, we can't separate the human heart from the environment outside us and say, once one of these is reformed, everything will be improved. We are organic with the world. Our inner life molds the environment and is itself deeply affected by it. The one acts upon the other, and every abiding change in the life of humanity is the result of these mutual reactions. So I interpret this to mean that we can't expect societies to change if we all stay the same. A new kind of world requires new kind of people to build it. When we give lip service to ideals without striving mightily to practice these qualities in our lives, it's like polishing our shell but refusing to hatch. It looks pretty perhaps, but the point is that we stretch ourselves to grow, to come alive with possibility, to break open our hard exterior so that we can truly live. And most importantly, we shouldn't expect it to always look or feel good. After all, you've all seen a chick when it first hatches. It's not cute. With that, I'll close with one of my favorite passages to remind each of us who we are. Dost thou reckon thyself only a puny form when within thee the universe is folded? It's from a text aptly named The Seven Valleys and the Four Valleys, a book about spiritual journey. And so if the pandemic is a portal, I suggest it's not only a social, economic, and political transformation that's underway, but it's also one that involves our spirit, our consciousness, and our vision. So with that, I'm going to transition now, stop sharing my screen, and invite any questions.
Oh, I'm muted. Thank you so much. What a beautiful presentation. And this point you made about how knowledge is joy, I think that really comes out in this, because even hearing all of these frustrating and disappointing statistics and headlines and examples of how these sort of systems that everything's built on are sort of crumbling beneath us, that knowledge is definitely a source of joy, and is a wonderful sort of way of moving towards this justice that feels very distant, but you know, kind of gradually we'll all hopefully, you know, work together to build. So just as sort of a reminder to everyone, we're going to jump into the Q&A portion now. I know we all have a lot going on in our heads, a lot to sort of settle in our own hearts and minds. So we invite you to submit questions to us through Instagram, Facebook, and email. On Instagram and Facebook, you can send us a message. So just go to our profile and hit the indicator to send a message to the account, and we will be asking your questions.
And while we do, I can riff off of what you
Sure.
just shared, because you know, that for me, that's always an important way to frame these conversations, because there's two sort of extremes. The one is, you know, people who are really interested in diagnosing the problem. They want to like get into the weeds, and the data is really important, and I'm all for that as a social scientist. But if we just stop there, it can lead to a kind of pessimism or skepticism about what we do about all those problems, you know? And so then we have the other extreme, which wants to skip over the mud, wants to skip over the trouble, wants to just get to the happy ending, right? And with that, that's a kind of naivety about what actually we need to change when you don't fully understand the scope of the problem. And so both of these ends, one, you know, so the Baha'i writings say, you know, religion without science is superstition, and science without religion, it lends to like mere materialism, right? And so we got to think about how to bring these social scientific facts into conversation with the spiritual vision, the spiritual principles, and try to integrate them so that we have a clear understanding of the scope of the problems that we're dealing with, but that we also feel energized to do our part on these little lives that we're leading, to pass the baton, to think about how we're going to contribute, rather than just feeling like, you know, there's no point to it.
Absolutely, absolutely. That sort of, you know, being motivated through what we're learning to then act and move towards justice, and realize how this is all sort of intrinsic to this sort of spiritual responsibility that we all have, where, you know, our existence in this world isn't just for ourselves, but it's so that we can better conditions for everyone around us.
Absolutely, this sense of collective responsibility. Oh, did I stop sharing? Oh, I think.
Okay, everybody. So we just got our first question in for Ruha from Ben Altair. I don't know if I'm pronouncing your last name wrong. Sorry about that. The question is, how can individuals who don't receive prejudice work to eradicate it? He's having trouble working through this question. He would love some feedback.
Okay, it's hard because we can't clarify the question, Ben. So when you say a person who doesn't receive prejudice, that part of the question it's hard for me to interpret. So I'll answer the part that I do understand, which is kind of like the individual's role in this, because I do think that if we are alive and we are in this fishbowl, then we have ingested many of the same kinds of logics, the same prejudices, the ways of seeing, the spectacles in which we see the world, have been shaped by the society. So I don't think you can be alive and be completely immune to it. And it requires a kind of vigilance. I think as soon as we assume that simply because we want to be prejudice-free, we are, and we let our guard down, and we don't stay on top of how these things infect our thinking and our views, then there's where the danger lies, is when we think we have it all figured out, right? And so there's no good guys here having this conversation that have it all figured out, and the so-called racists out there. We are all trying to be vigilant about, you know, extracting, you know, these anti-Black and other kinds of views from our lens. And so the role of the individual then is both in terms of the sort of internal and external, because we are what we do. And that's kind of the point I was getting to at the end, is that the environments that we're in shape us, but we also shape our environments. And so I think as a social scientist, you know, my training is to look at how the social forces get under the skin, into our worldviews. But the flip side of that is that people create environments. People are institutions. People are societies. Those aren't entities that exist outside of human agency and action. So if there is this reciprocal relationship, it means what you do and think has the potential to shape what's around you. And so my view is that we all have a sphere of influence. Sometimes we think, oh, that's where the powerful people are, over there, right? It's the people deciding the policy, or the people running this company or this institution. And in only seeing power as residing in certain arenas and certain tiers of society, in some ways we give up our own power, our own ability to influence. So whether you are a parent at a playground most of the day, you know, looking at preschoolers and watching your child play, that is a sphere of influence. In fact, I would say that that is ground zero for seeding many of the old ways of thinking and potentially the new ways of thinking. And so the playground as a site of influence, we often don't associate that as a space of power, right? But that is where we're actually beginning to mold how children see one another. And you can ask many parents, many Black parents in particular, who have seen their children rejected first at playgrounds, and preschoolers playing. And so lest we think that that is not actually affected by these larger forces, we're wrong. And so part of what we have to do, perhaps now that many of us are forced to pull back from the busyness of everyday life, is to think about, what is our sphere of influence? So that's a one part of it. But then I don't want to end there and just you know, assume that all we are is individuals. The last thing I'll say is that we really want to think about how to harness the power of collective action and community life, that we don't only see ourselves as free-floating individuals, what I think changes the world, what the world changes me, but how we harness our ways of relating with one another. And that's where I talked about community life as a laboratory, because you can believe all kinds of things, you know, people should treat each other fairly, people should look at each other with, you know, through a lens of dignity and worth. But you can have all those great ideas floating up your head. But until you get into the everyday, you know, sort of back and forth of community life, your beliefs are just theories. They have to be tested through interaction, through conflict, through possible disunity, you know? And so we want to think about how community life and interacting with people offers an opportunity to test our lofty beliefs. If you say that you are prejudice-free, that is, you know, you can't really say that unless it's tested with people you don't like. And so what does that look like? And so I think we want to also think about, once we leave this moment of social distancing, to think about what it looks like to test our beliefs in interaction and in community life.
Okay, wow, we are actually getting a ton of questions in right now. So
why don't you ask a few of them, and then I'll see if perhaps I'll try to weave my comments together.
All right, so I'll read these next two for you. How can we create justice when stuck at home? And what do you do to stay motivated and create hope when working with such difficult statistics?
Yeah, those are two pieces of a pie, you know? And so partly we want to see how sociality and interaction doesn't end just because we're not physically co-present with each other, right? So we're interacting in various ways. I know we've all had our fill of like the Zoom and all the virtual things, but you know, there are other ways of interacting. If you're by yourself, that's one. And so that's why, if you notice, I said briefly in my comments that we even have to enact justice with our own selves. Like, justice isn't just an external feature of the world. We want just laws, we want just policies, we want just institutions, but even in our own thoughts, we can be unfair. with ourselves and with one another, right? In terms of, you know, even allowing ourselves to think independently without the yoke of, you know, what other people are going to say or what other people will think. And so a beautiful quote from the Baha'i writings talks about the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice, to see with thine own eyes and not through the eyes of others, to know of your own knowledge and not the knowledge of your neighbor. So there's a way in which, even if you think about how the educational system doesn't allow young people to develop their own knowledge about things, that's a form of injustice that doesn't look like a teacher, kicking a kid out of class. That's like an obvious one, suspending, but even in the curriculum, not allowing certain forms of knowledge to flourish is a form of injustice. So in your own reading and study, what are you exposing yourself to? What are you allowing to grow inside your mind and heart? So we can practice justice even internally, even if we're not out at this particular moment, you know, trying to work towards the more external forms of justice. Likewise with hopefulness, I'll just return to a point I made early on, is that, you know, things like hope and love, you know, we often think of them at the level of sentiment, you know, Valentine's Day, flowers, chocolate, how we feel. But really thinking about what, you know, the educator Miriam Kaba says. She says, hope is a discipline, which to me means it's something that we have to practice. It's a way of actually, you know, whatever we are, again, going back to our thoughts, our thoughts kind of can breed hopefulness or hopelessness, you know, depending on the thoughts that we allow to tread over and over. And so we want to be disciplined in, you know, how we engage these statistics, for example. You know, I, as a social scientist, am exposed to mounds and mounds of data, and I realize that how we interpret the data varies dramatically, and it can either make us feel frozen in place or it can galvanize us. For me, anger about this data is fuel. It's not something that I try to quash. I don't try to stop myself from being angry. I try to metabolize this anger and use it as fuel to give me energy to want to change both the internal and external structures. And so thinking about exposure to this is like, yes, show me that inequality, because then I'm going to metabolize it and work even harder to try to address it in my little sphere of influence. And so it's partly the lens that we place on the bad news that will either make us feel stuck or make us feel energized to work with other people to try to transform the status quo.
Thank you. As Mariah mentioned, we have a ton of questions coming in, so I'm trying to like bundle them together.
Okay.
But we have a lot of questions about that sort of follow a similar thread of how do we help the people who are all the way on the margins of need and vulnerability, and then how do we engage with people who are on the other side in terms of racist thinking and engagement, whether that's in our own communities with adults or even among middle schoolers, like sort of kids who are just beginning to think about these things for the first time, maybe.
Yeah.
We kind of, yeah.
No, go ahead.
And get the message out.
Yeah, I have lots of thoughts, and I'll try to synthesize and keep my responses shorter so we can get to more of them. So the short version of, you know, the margins, it goes for the margins to like the privilege, let's say, or what have you. So first thing when I think about helping people at the margins is that, you know, we don't want to have a kind of charity model or a model in which, you know, a kind of savior complex. We want to collaborate with people and communities that are already helping themselves, that are already doing things. How can we support? How can we be in solidarity? So we want to move away from a kind of colonial mindset of going in and saving people from these terrible things. Because with almost every problem that I can point to, I can also point to individuals and communities who are most affected by it, who are working towards it, but often who people don't listen to because they don't have fancy titles and degrees. And so partly the issue is actually to amplify the people who are most affected by a problem, to be able to shape what they think are part of the solution, rather than trying to create solutions for people. So that's the short version of that. Then when we talk about the privilege, there's a lot to unravel there, but one of the key things I want us to think about is that even people in groups who are benefiting at one level from systems of oppression. We call them the privileged, you call them dominant groups, oppressive, whatever the language you want to use. They may be benefiting at one level, but they're also deeply harmed at another level, at a deeper level in terms of their humanity and in terms of even their physical bodies. And I'll just try to synthesize this very quickly, is that we know that when we have data across different US states and across different countries. And what we see is that societies in which the gap between the haves and the have-nots are wide, the haves in those societies, even they are sicker and not doing as well as the haves in societies and contexts where the gap is smaller, where there's less inequality, which tells us something, that even though at one level, this gap of people who are monopolizing resources, wealth, status, respect, at another level, their bodies often are internalizing the inequality, they're internalizing the injustice. I went to high school in Swaziland, you know, a place where lots of high walls, people who have some wealth, you know, live in fortresses, right? Because of the inequality. You think about what it means to put yourself into a fortress or a prison in order to protect what you have. It starts to get to you. In the US, we see across US states, those who are privileged. And so this is something like, think about how to translate this for middle schoolers, which is the question. How do we communicate the fact that even if you might be benefiting at one level, there's another level in which you are harmed by systems of inequality, which it also gets under the skin. And we can look at it at the level of health. We can think about the kind of anxiety that it breeds, the paranoia, the stress, the anger that it breeds of those who are the haves in a context. And so the takeaway is that we all ultimately benefit by working towards equity and justice. On one level, it may feel like giving up something, but on another more fundamental level, we all benefit when we are all doing well. And so that we should have a stake in this, not out of a charity for someone else or because we want to help undeserved groups, but because we ourselves benefit from this justice at an even more fundamental level.
Thank you. So the next kind of batch of questions, there were some comments about sort of collective versus individual action. We had someone also say, I fear that within our communities, we lack the level of understanding about our own vulnerabilities, and sort of this relationship between collective versus individual, and then also kind of within that where social, economic, and political change might occur, kind of on that bigger level. So if you could talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. And so, you know, in some ways it's one of those, you know, false dichotomies. Where does the individual end and the collective start? And again, we could go to extremes where some people only want to focus on themselves and how to make themselves, like, develop these attributes that are about being good and just and loving. But like I said, when you think of it only at the individual level, your beliefs never get tested, right? But the opposite of that is only to try to think about working externally, working as a group, working as a community, working on policies and laws. And then you realize, oh, well, you know, I may feel like the police are being unjust, but perhaps I'm policing people in my own lives in ways that are unjust, where you never take stock of your own internalization of the kind of logics that you're critical of out there. And so that's why these extremes about only doing things as individuals or only doing things as communities or collectives, it's a false choice, because we need both to actually grow as individuals and collectives. And so, you know, there's more to say there, but again, it's thinking about the kind of reciprocal nature of growth, spiritual growth, when it comes to all of the issues that we're talking about. And then the role of, you know, economic, social policy. This is part of what I was hinting to when I was talking about how we're organic with the world. You know, we will never, as individuals, be able to truly flourish and exhibit, you know, our full potential if we live in contexts that are constantly squashing that ability. Again, I always go back to the educational system because it's a ground zero. You know, the thing about the educational system is, in theory, it should be the engine of human knowledge, of flourishing, of progress, of vision, of, you know, all of these great things. But in reality, this very institution is what reproduces inequality. It reproduces all of the worst tendencies of human society. So within this one institution, you have the theoretical role of it, but then actually how it functions. And so we have to think about how in that context, yes, we want policies and different educational policies. For example, very simply, the fact that in most places in the US, the property tax is used to actually fund public schools. That means that if historically our neighborhoods have been segregated, wealth has been concentrated in white communities and divested from Black and other racialized communities, and now we say, oh, public schools are going to be funded based on property tax. That means historically you've embedded this inequality in our housing and neighborhood structure, and it continues to reproduce this inequality in our educational structure. So yes, a change in policy would mean not relying simply on property tax as a way, as the funding for our educational system, because as long as we do, it's going to be deeply inequitable, almost apartheid-like. That said, even if we change, even when we change those policies so that we're distributing the wealth across our entire society, if individuals who work in those schools that now in this speculative vision I'm giving that have the similar amount of wealth to work with, if the individuals within those schools still hold on to deeply flawed visions of which children have greater potential, they might have the same resources, but the way in which they treat those children, the way in which they divert those resources will still continue to reproduce that inequality. So we need that change in policy, but that we can't end there and say, okay, let's change the social and economic policy, and then we leave it to individuals whose minds and hearts are still in the mud of anti-Blackness and racism and classism, because they will continue to find ways, very innovative ways, to reproduce inequality. So we need the transformation both within and the transformation in terms of the external context and the policies and the structures. They have to go hand in hand for us to actually address it.
Completely, Ruha. Thank you for that. So I just want to mention to everybody that we are streaming this talk on our Facebook page. So we have a couple questions about the slides that you shared in your presentation. So you guys can go on there after to watch the live feed to get those specific slides and the writings that she was addressing. So
and I'm also happy to give to Bahai.chat a link to just access the slides by themselves in case anyone wants to use it for their own purposes.
Okay, great.
So then with that, if people want those slides, subscribe to our newsletter and we can send them out. That's on our website. Yes.
Okay. So these next couple of questions address the children more so. So what advice do you have for teaching children middle school age how to respond when they are the target of racist behavior or witness racist behavior? Another one goes about, please talk about the global digital divide. My students cannot participate in online classes with me. And then can you talk a bit more about what Black pathology means and how it influences and or reflects society's perception of race and inequality? So a couple of questions there.
Y'all asking dissertation level questions, aren't you? You're gonna have to sign up for my class. These are good. I'm not gonna even be able to, fully flesh out. I mean, I love the people who are asking questions about middle schoolers, children. I think, in some ways, by the time the students get to me as freshmen, many of them are frustrated that this is often the first time that they're being challenged to think about certain things. And so they're ready and hungry for this much earlier. Just to the question about, experiencing forms of racism as a young person, as a middle schooler. I mean, in some ways there's a responsibility on the part of families and parents, but also, and educators and institutions that, we have a tendency of, trying to either minimize or tell people to forget or don't pay attention, ignore them. And I think that gives license for these racist forms of interaction to continue, where even like yesterday, I was watching this TikTok of two seniors who were supposed to be graduating from a high school, create a very racist TikTok that was deeply anti-Black, that took every anti-Black stereotype you could imagine and created this skit around it. And now, you know, they're not able to graduate now, but to think about how you can get to that level, graduating senior, and not have a basic understanding of racial literacy, historical trauma, etc. And so the earlier we start to deal with this, nip it in the bud, the better, rather than saying, you know, just ignore them, or, you know, we need to bring the parents in. It needs to be not simply an understanding of an individual offense, but it's a collective offense that we allow children to even go to the next grade and to think of themselves as educated when they don't have basic understandings of these things. But again, it's at the familial level, at the institutional level. So if you are a parent in this context, don't wipe it under the rug, you know, because that means that someone else is going to have to deal with that, you know. And so we need to find ways to address this through models of, you know, thinking about transformative justice kind of models where we put it all out in the open and we think about who and what needs to change so it doesn't continue happening, rather than simply punishing it. Because when you punish someone or something, it doesn't transform the behavior, it doesn't transform the mindset that has produced the behavior. And so we have to think about how to be more creative and open about these forms of harm that are perpetuated. The global digital divide is a huge, huge thing. I've written a whole little book about it called Race After Technology. But again, the issue is not simply access. And so, yes, at this moment, we're seeing how, you know, the fact that many, many students in New York City, one of the richest cities in the world, how hundreds of thousands of students don't have access to the very devices and internet that would allow them to continue schooling at this time. So that's being exposed. It's coming to light around that. But it's not simply about access to the internet or devices. Even once you have access to it, forms of harm can still be perpetuated through the educational system. And so we want to think about what we have control over at this moment. And my colleague, my friend last week, Homo Tabangar, talked about, you know, in Philly, one particular way that it could and is being addressed. So again, that's one I can't really fully get into. And how are we doing on time?
So I want to jump in because we are hitting the hour now.
Yeah.
So thank you to everyone who's staying on with us. But I wanted just to sort of pivot a little bit as a last question and ask you, why turn to the Baha'i writings? Like, what is it about the Baha'i faith that gives a view that's unique to the science and the sociology and the study that you are so embedded in?
Yeah, I mean, that's like $1 million question. And for me, again, it's being so steeped in a rigorous social scientific diagnosis of the problem. But the vision of how we transform the problem doesn't come to us from the facts. It doesn't come to us from the social science. That has to be paired with a spiritual vision, which I believe the Baha'i writings and Baha'u'llah offers. It's the most recent world religion. And at the core of it is this idea that Baha'u'llah says the best beloved of all things in my sight is justice. And that we're not going to get any kind of unity, any kind of global cooperation without trying to practice justice in our institutions and in our daily lives. So it's my love for justice that draws me to the Baha'i writings and tries to pair my understanding of the problem with a vision of how we pragmatically try to practice these beliefs and these teachings in community life through the way that we educate children and teach them about their worth, through the way that we interact at the level of consultation. So the idea that the clash of differing opinions brings the spark of truth. So we're not supposed to avoid conflict. We're supposed to actually allow our differing opinions to actually converge so that we can understand which directions we want to go. And there's a long list of very practical, pragmatic ways in which Baha'i communities are trying to test our belief in the oneness of humanity to actually try to bring it into being, not through lip service, not through, you know, naming certain platitudes that sound good at the level of theory, but through trying to actually work in the mud through this. And so I would invite people who want to check it out. You know, there's Baha'i communities all over the world. And if you want to get in touch with local Baha'is near you, to reach out to them, now's a good time. People don't have anywhere to go. So.
Absolutely. So thank you so much, Ruha, for sharing such beautiful insights and perspectives and wisdom. And thank you to everybody who joined us for this fruitful and rich conversation. We just want to remind you, you can subscribe to our newsletter on our website, Bahai.chat. Scroll all the way down, you'll see it at the bottom. find us on social media. You can also email us if you do want to be connected to a Baha'i community, you have questions about the Baha'i faith, feel free to email us and we'll do our best to connect you. And then as a reminder, our talk next week is going to be by William Smitty Smith, who is the head of the National Race Amity Project, talking a little bit more about a different angle about race in America and how we can sort of overcome these great injustices that we all experience and observe every day. So with that, thank you again to everyone for joining us. Thank you to Ruha. And what a beautiful way to spend a Saturday afternoon. Thank you.
Yes. I also wanted to mention to the people whose questions did not get answered, you can also send those to our email at info@Bahai.chat, and we will be surely to get those over to Ruha. We had so many great questions. It was hard to pick and choose from all of them. And if you want to know more information about Ruha and her mission and what she's doing in the world, you can visit ruhabenjamin.com. And in this part of the speech, we are all done. We're going to open up mics to everybody so that we can all say bye and be with our day.
Thank you so much.
Happy birthday, Anissa.
Bye.
Good to see you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Allow us all. Thank you.
Peace and blessings. Peace and blessings.